Hi everyone, it's Rebecca here from Featherstitch House and welcome to our first stitch tutorial video for 2022. Now for January I thought we'd start at the very beginning and explore the most simple of all stitches, and that's straight stitch. So in this video I'm going to show you the basics of straight stitch, and then we're going to look at some variations and see how we can adapt the stitch to add some interest and texture to our work. So I'm not going to talk anymore now. Grab a needle and some thread and a little bit of fabric if you want to sew along with me, and let's explore straight stitch. Let's get going. So the first stitch I'm going to show you is a running stitch, and it's probably the one that you already know. It's the one that every child learns to do first. It's the simplest of all the stitches. You just literally take your needle up through the fabric and down. Okay, so I've got my fabric in my hoop. This is just a natural linen fabric, and we're just going to do a line of running stitch. I've just, by the way, knotted the end of my thread. I am not precious about knotting, particularly working on felt. If you don't do a sizable knot, it will just pull through the felt. So I've just put a knot in the end of my thread and I'm just pulling it through. So I've taken it up there and I'm just pulling it through, and I'm just going to go along a little bit from where my thread came up, and I'm going to take my needle back through and pull it, not tight but just enough so that the thread lies flat on the fabric. So I'm going to go a little bit along, not as long a gap as the stitch that I just made, just maybe half the length of the stitch. So I'm going to go up again and I'm going to go down. I'm going to try and keep my stitches as even as possible, following along that line, just working along that line, going up and then back down, and just create my line. It's like a dashed line of running stitches. Okay, now you can mix it up, you can leave bigger gaps, you can make your stitches smaller. I'm doing fairly sizable stitches so that you can see what I'm doing, and I'm just working along my line, going up and down all the way along. Okay, let's just do one more. Up and down. So that's a basic running stitch, and it's really nice actually. It's quite I think we often, once we get into embroidery, we overlook the easier stitches, but it just gives a really nice folksy feel to things that you make. I actually quite like it. It's quite a sweet stitch to use to outline things or that sort of thing. Now, a variation on running stitch is seed stitch, and it's basically running stitch but not in a line. It's running stitch that goes in all sorts of directions. So I'm just going to use this little space up here to demonstrate some seed stitch. Now with seed stitch you want to keep the stitches quite small, and you basically fill an area by just doing running stitches in all sorts of different directions, and it's a harder thing to do than it sounds, because you tend to fall into patterns of working in particular directions, and so you've got to work quite hard to make sure your stitches aren't all accidentally lining up. A good tip is to turn your work as you're doing it, and it will help you keep your stitches running in all sorts of different directions. So if you just do a few stitches one way and then turn your work and do some more, it will look more random if you do it that way. So this is a great way of adding texture to your work. It's great for filling areas in a sort of more subtle way. It looks great if you work in variegated thread, so that's thread that changes colour as you go along. So you can fill shapes. It's also nice for using negative space, so you can use seed stitch around a shape that you've drawn, and just not put any stitches inside the shape, and it just makes that shape stand out even more. So I'll just do a couple more, and that gives you the idea of how to do seed stitch. So there we go, that's seed stitch. All right, so a variation on running stitch, where you just come up and go down but work in lots of different directions. And so I'm just going to finish my thread, and it's a good opportunity for me to show you how to finish thread so that you can start again. Lots of different ways of doing it. I like to, you can weave in and out of the stitches that you've done if you want to, but I like to make sure it's very secure, because I often make things that are going to be used rather than just displayed. So I've just made a loop by going under a stitch and then under it again, and I'm just taking my needle through that loop, and I'm going to pull on my thread and go back through that second loop and pull it tight. Then I'm just going to snip it off to leave a short tail. Okay, so that's how I'm finishing off my thread. Okay, so the next stitch we're going to do is back stitch. Okay, now back stitch is a variation on running stitch, but you work back on yourself with each stitch. So it's still just coming up and going down, but you do it in a slightly different order. So with back stitch, we don't want to start at the very end of our line. We want to come in a little bit from the end of our line. Okay, so we're going to bring our needle up, and then we're going to go back on ourselves a little way, and we're going to put the needle back through there. So we've worked a stitch backwards. Now we're going to come along, and we're going to come up a stitch length further along the line, so we're going to leave a little bit of a gap. So on the back of the fabric I've gone a little bit further, and sometimes you might need to poke your needle through a few times just to make sure you've got the length of the stitch right. And we've come up, and I'm going to pull my needle through, and I'm going to go back down right at the end of that first stitch that I sewed. Okay, so our stitches are working back on ourselves. Okay, so again I'm going to come up a stitch length further along my line and pull my needle through, and then I'm going to go back down right at the end of that second stitch. Okay, along a little way and back down. So again, along one stitch length and back down. So just like running stitch, we're coming up and going down, but this time we're working back on ourselves. Along a little way and back down. Okay, so that's back stitch. So let me demonstrate finishing my thread again. I'm going to go under the stitch to make a loop. All my loops all gathered up, and then I'm going to go through the loop that I've just made, pull on the working thread and take my needle back through that new loop and snip off my thread. I'm just going to demonstrate straight stitch, because this is quite a useful stitch as well. I'm going to go back to my space at the top there. So straight stitches are just any long stitches, and you can use them to make flower stems, you can use them to add texture or a little bit of highlight or low light. So you can just basically make stitches just by sort of elongating seed stitches and add them going in lots of different directions. So that's a straight stitch, and that means that you can make little shapes. So if you wanted to, the most simple way, I'm just doing a small triangle here, so you can use straight stitches to make little shapes on your work. So I'm just putting 3 straight stitches that join together in the corner, and I've got a little triangle. You can use them to make letters. So there's a little F that I've just stitched just with straight stitch. You can also make little stars very easily by just putting some straight stitches over the top of each other, joining at the centre. So just your normal star. Sometimes this is called a double cross stitch, but it's just a little star like that. So you can do all sorts of things with straight stitches and play around and really just experiment and see what you can do. So that's a straight stitch. The last one I'm going to show you, which is a variation again on straight stitch, is a cross stitch. So I've got 2 lines left here, and for this one I'm going to start on the left. Really just do what works for you. I don't really fully believe in all the rules that people have for embroidery. I just think just go for it. You can always hide the back, is not a problem. Alright, so a cross stitch is a set of straight stitches worked on an angle. So what I need to imagine is that there are some vertical lines. You can draw them if you want to, between my 2 parallel lines. And I'm going to come up in the top left corner, and then I'm going to go across to the bottom right corner of my imaginary box. And again, you can work these very close together. You can make them very small, you can make them very large, it's up to you. But I'm going to work on a sort of square. So my lines are about 1 centimetre apart. So I'll show you how to do a single cross stitch, and then I'll show you how to do a line. So I've gone top left to bottom right. So now I'm going to come up top right, directly above the end of that first stitch. So I'm going to come up top right, and I'm going to go down bottom left and form my little cross. If you're doing a line of them, I would suggest that you have all of your stitches going in the same direction. It looks much neater when the stitch that's lying on top is always going in the same direction. So I'm going to do all of my left to rights, and I'm just working along my line, run out of thread, so I'll stop there, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to do all my right to left. Will she finish? And again, you can space these out, you can join them together to make a bit of a lattice. I'm going to have to stop there because I've run out of thread. But you can work them all together like that. So it looks really lovely when they're laid over the top of each other, and you vary your colours and put pops of a different colour in. So that's our straight stitch collection. So just to review, what have we done? We've looked at running stitch. We did that one first, that's running stitch. Then we did seed stitch, which is running stitch but going in all sorts of different directions. Then we looked at back stitch, which is the one where you go back on yourself. Then we looked at straight stitch and how we can use it to make shapes and letters and stars, and use it in lots of different ways as we see the need. And then finally we've looked at cross stitch. So these are straight stitches worked on diagonals, worked quite regularly on diagonals, and then working back the way we came, going in the other direction. So these are our January stitches. Hope you have fun practicing with those, and I will see you in the next video. Happy stitching, happy crafting, and I'll see you next time.